Getting to net zero emissions by 2050. For a livable climate. Net zero commitments must be backed by credible action. What is net zero? Put simply, net zero means cutting greenhouse gas emissions to as close to zero as possible, with any remaining emissions reabsorbed from the atmosphere, by oceans and forests for instance. Why is net zero important? Science shows clearly that in order to avert the worst impacts of climate change and preserve a livable planet, global temperature increase needs to be limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Currently, the Earth is already about 1.1 degrees Celsius warmer than it was in the late 1800s, and emissions continue to rise. To keep global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, as called for in the Paris Agreement, emissions need to be reduced by 45% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. How can net zero be achieved? Transitioning to a net zero world is one of the greatest challenges humankind has faced. It calls for nothing less than a complete transformation of how we produce, consume, and move about. The energy sector is the source of around 3/4 of greenhouse gas emissions today, and holds the key to averting the worst effects of climate change. Replacing polluting coal, gas and oil-fired power with energy from renewable sources, such as wind or solar, would dramatically reduce carbon emissions. Is there a global effort to reach net zero? Yes, a growing coalition of countries, cities, businesses, and other institutions are pledging to get to net zero emissions. More than 70 countries, including the biggest polluters China, the United States, and the European Union, have set a net zero target, covering about 76% of global emissions. More than 3,000 businesses and financial institutions are working with the Science Based Targets initiative to reduce their emissions in line with climate science. And more than 1,000 cities, over 1,000 educational institutions, and over 400 financial institutions have joined the race to zero, pledging to take rigorous, immediate action to halve global emissions by 2030. How do we ensure commitments are turned into action? The growth in net zero pledges has been accompanied by a proliferation of criteria with varying levels of robustness. To develop stronger and clearer standards for net zero emissions pledges by non-state entities such as businesses, investors, cities and regions, and speed up their implementation, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, in March 2022 established a high-level expert group on the net zero emissions commitments of non-state entities. The expert group presented its recommendations at COP27 on the 8th of November 2022. Are we on track to reach net zero by 2050? No. Commitments made by governments to date fall far short of what is required. Current national climate plans, for 193 parties to the Paris Agreement taken together, would lead to a sizable increase of almost 11% in global greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, compared to 2010 levels. Getting to net zero requires all governments, first and foremost the biggest emitters, to significantly strengthen their nationally determined contributions, NDCs, and take bold, immediate steps towards reducing emissions now. The Glasgow Climate Pact called on all countries to revisit and strengthen the 2030 targets in their NDCs by the end of 2022, but only 24 new or updated climate plans were submitted by September 2022. Most emissions come from just a few countries. The top 7 emitters: China, the United States of America, India, the European Union, Indonesia, the Russian Federation, Brazil accounted for about half of global greenhouse gas emissions in 2020. The Group of 20: Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, France, Germany, India, Indonesia, Italy, Japan, Republic of Korea, Mexico, Russia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Turkey, the United Kingdom, the United States, and the European Union are responsible for about 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Governments have the biggest responsibility in the transition to net zero emissions by mid-century. But businesses, investors, cities, states and regions also need to live up to their net zero promises. A high-level expert group convened by the UN Secretary-General and chaired by former Canadian Minister Catherine McKenna developed stronger and clearer standards for net zero emissions pledges by non-state entities. Credibility and accountability of net zero emissions commitments of non-state entities. The United Nations Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, on the 31st of March 2022, established a high-level expert group on the net zero emissions commitments of non-state entities to develop stronger and clearer standards for net zero emissions pledges by non-state entities, including businesses, investors, cities, and regions, and speed up their implementation. With the launch of the report, Integrity Matters: Net Zero Commitments by Businesses, Financial Institutions, Cities and Regions, at the UN Climate Conference, COP27, in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, the group has successfully finalized its work and delivered on its mandate. We must have zero tolerance for net zero greenwashing, said the Secretary-General at the launch event that took place on the 8th of November 2022. The report provides clarity in 4 key areas: environmental integrity, credibility, accountability, and the role of governments. The Secretary-General has issued specific asks to implement the group's recommendations, a process led by his Climate Action Team, in close collaboration with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. He also described the expected next steps for existing and new net zero voluntary initiatives, ahead of the Climate Ambition Summit and COP28, expected to take place later this year. Among other things, the Secretary-General called on non-state entities to put forward credible and transparent transition plans, and to submit them before the end of this year. Since the adoption of the Paris Agreement in 2015, the world has seen an increasing number of net zero commitments by non-state actors, in particular from the private and financial sectors, as well as from local government and regions. The growth in pledges has been accompanied by a proliferation of criteria and benchmarks to set net zero commitments with varying levels of robustness. This misleads consumers, investors, and regulators with false narratives, and it feeds a culture of climate misinformation and confusion. The 10 recommendations, outlined in the report, are a how-to guide for credible, accountable net zero pledges and detail what non-state actors need to consider through each stage of their progress towards achieving net zero ambitions and addressing the climate crisis. The road to net zero. 2015. 196 countries adopted the historic Paris Agreement to reduce global warming and build resilience to climate change. Its overall goal: limit warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. 2015 to 2017. Parties to the agreement began submitting climate action plans known as Nationally Determined Contributions, NDCs. Initial commitments, even if fully implemented, would only be enough to slow warming to 3 degrees. Urgent calls for action and ambition gained momentum as the plans would not stop catastrophic impacts. 2020 to 2021. In the lead-up to the COP26 climate talks, countries have begun revising their NDCs to strengthen climate action. With science affirming a shrinking window of opportunity, the plans must include urgent actions to cut carbon emissions and reach net zero by 2050. 2030. To keep warming to 1.5 degrees, countries must cut emissions by at least 45% compared to 2010 levels. 2050. The transition to net zero emissions must be fully complete. If you like Today Plus channel's video, please like, subscribe, share and turn on notifications. Stay tuned for more our interesting subjects.